What if I told you that behind one of Hollywood's most charming homes lay a secret so horrifying it forced even the most seasoned detectives to step outside and throw up? Because that's exactly what happened when authorities entered Rob Reiner's Brentwood estate that Sunday morning. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. A 78-year-old legend of American cinema and his elegant wife, Michelle, 70, both found brutally stabbed in their own mansion. But that wasn't the end. No, that was just the beginning. Because a few hours later, officers opened the garage door, and what they saw inside shattered everything they thought they knew about the Reiners, their legacy, and their son. What they found was beyond murder. It was ritualistic, cold, calculated, and filled with a level of evil most people can't even imagine. And it had been right there, under their noses, for years. So how did no one see it? Why didn't anyone stop it? And how long had the truth been buried? Literally, beneath layers of Hollywood charm, red carpet smiles, and directors' chairs. Let's start at the top. But be warned, once we open that garage, there's no going back. It was 10:02 a.m. when the housekeeper dialed 911. Her name was Graciela. She'd worked for the Reiner family for over 20 years. Through birthdays, breakups, premiere parties, and holiday dinners. She knew that house better than most. And she knew something was wrong the moment she stepped out of her car. The gate was slightly ajar. The morning newspaper, usually taken in by 7:30, was still sitting outside. The curtains on the main floor were drawn tightly shut, which never happened unless Rob was reviewing a rough cut of a film. But he hadn't worked on a movie in over a year. And the dogs, silent. Always barking when she arrived. But that day, not a sound. Her gut told her something was off. She rang the bell. Once. Twice. No answer. She called Romy, their daughter, but the call went to voicemail. Then she walked around the side of the property and knocked on the glass of the kitchen door. Still nothing. But it was unlocked. She stepped inside and screamed. The kitchen was a bloodbath. Red footprints stained the white tile floor. A chair was knocked over. And Rob's signature beige sweater lay crumpled on the floor, soaked in something far darker than spilled coffee. She ran. Outside. To the driveway. And that's when she noticed it. The garage door. It wasn't fully closed. Just cracked open. About a foot. As if someone had peeked out from inside and forgotten to seal it shut. But at that moment, she didn't care about the garage. Her bosses were missing. She was trembling, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. Crying as she tried to explain what she'd seen. Within 12 minutes, the first officers arrived. And within 30, the Reiner estate was a sealed crime scene. Let's pause for a moment. Because Rob Reiner wasn't just anyone. This was Rob Reiner. The man behind When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, Stand By Me. A producer, a director, an activist. A man whose father, Carl Reiner, was comedy royalty. A man whose children grew up in the limelight. And Michelle, his rock. A quiet force behind the scenes. A social justice warrior. Loved by everyone in the LA elite. Together, they were Hollywood royalty. So when news broke that they had been found murdered in their own home, stabbed repeatedly, the world gasped. But that gasp turned into something darker when the garage was opened. Because nothing could prepare anyone for what was inside. Not even the detectives. Captain Delia Torres was first to approach. A veteran of over 100 homicide investigations. She'd seen cartel killings, serial cases, and grisly murder-suicides. But this was different. Something about the air. She would later say it felt thicker, heavier. Like the air itself didn't want to be breathed. Her team stood back as she lifted the steel handle on the garage door. It creaked. Slowly. Painfully. Then light poured in. And with it, the smell. One officer dry-heaved before he even saw anything. Another covered his nose and stepped back. Because what they saw, what they smelled was death. Not just death. Many deaths. Stacked. Wrapped. Hidden behind sheet-covered furniture, behind old boxes, beneath layers of dust and tools. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just the bodies that shocked them. It was who they belonged to. Some had ID tags still on them. Long-lost individuals. Missing persons who'd vanished over the past decade. Some were too decomposed to identify on sight. Some looked like they had been placed there only days ago. And one was holding a note, with handwriting that matched someone very, very close to the family. The call went out immediately. FBI, forensics, coroner. The Reiner garage was no longer a storage space. It was a crime scene, a crypt, a museum of madness. And at the center of it all, Nick Reiner, Rob and Michelle's 32-year-old son, screenwriter, former addict, quiet, reclusive, living in the guest house just behind the main home. He said he hadn't seen his parents that morning, claimed he'd been asleep, offered no resistance when they asked to search his room. But when they did, they found something chilling. A wall covered in sketches. Some of them were faces, others maps, red string, headshots of unknown people, a list titled, "Should Have Been Stopped," and one photo of Rob and Michelle, both with red XS through their eyes. The detectives stared at the scene. One whispered, "It's like something out of a horror film." But here's the twist. Rob Reiner made films. And Nick? Nick had always wanted to direct one of his own. He just didn't tell anyone the script he was working on was real. So now the question becomes, was this a family tragedy? Or something far more calculated? Was Nick the only one involved? Or had the Reiner home been a hub for something darker? Why were some of the victims unknown to the family? Why did one of them match a missing person from New York? And how long had the garage been a tomb? Weeks? Months? Years? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered secrets about Rob and Michelle no one could have imagined. Deals made behind closed doors. People paid to disappear. Allegiances to powerful names in Hollywood. Names that now appeared on notes found inside the garage. Because this wasn't just a murder scene. This was a message, written in blood, and someone wanted it read. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What came next was the silence. Not the chaotic, overlapping panic of flashing lights and panicked neighbors. Not the questions shouted by reporters from behind yellow tape. Not even the murmurs of investigators still trying to process what they'd found in the garage. No, this was a different kind of silence. It was the kind that settled in when every word failed. When the truth became too much. When everyone in the room looked at each other, quietly realizing the nightmare had only just begun. Because as detectives turned away from the gruesome scene inside the garage and looked back toward the house, one question lingered in all their minds. How many more? You see, this wasn't some random act of violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing valuables, no panicked scuffle that ended in tragedy. This was personal and prolonged, the kind of rage that builds over time, the kind of planning that takes years. The kind of darkness that doesn't explode overnight, but instead rots quietly in the walls of a house that looked perfect from the outside. Sound familiar? How many times have we seen the same story play out in headlines? Smiling family, beautiful home, whispered secrets, but then someone opens a door, or a closet, or, in this case, a garage, and suddenly the fairy tale crumbles into a horror film no one ever bought tickets to. But here's the twist. In this film, the director was one of their own. Let's talk about Nick, the only surviving child of Rob and Michelle. To the public, he was a quiet, creative, misunderstood soul. To those closer to the family, he was troubled. To the police, he was suspect number one. Why? Because he was the only one with access. The only one who didn't answer calls that morning. The only one who'd been living, undisturbed, in the guest house just a few feet away from where his parents were brutally murdered. But even more chilling? He was the only one with a key to the garage. Let that sink in. He had a key. He lived on the property. And he had a history most people were too polite or too afraid to talk about. Rewind 10 years. Nick Reiner was a rising screenwriter with a powerful last name and a very public past. He'd struggled with drug addiction in his teens, was sent to rehab multiple times, even co-wrote a film about it, Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical movie directed by his father, Rob. A project praised for its honesty, vulnerability, and redemption arc. It was supposed to be Nick's turning point. The moment he came clean, literally and figuratively. The moment he stepped out of the shadow of addiction and into a future full of second chances. But behind the scenes, things weren't so simple. Sources say the father-son dynamic was tense. Nick wanted creative independence. Rob still saw him as a fragile child. The emotional friction never quite eased. And then, after the film's modest success, Nick disappeared from the spotlight altogether. No new scripts, no public appearances, Just the occasional Instagram post. A vague quote. A black and white photo of the beach. Quiet. Almost too quiet. Until now. Because here's where things get really disturbing. Detectives now believe Nick may have been leading a double life. By day, the reclusive son of a famous filmmaker. By night, something else entirely. Inside the garage, investigators didn't just find bodies. They found a system. Shelves of labeled jars. Filing cabinets organized by date, initials, and, in some cases, methods of restraint. A whiteboard covered in codes. Some were simple, others baffling. But one phrase kept reappearing again and again. Guilt must be preserved. What does that even mean? Was it a motto? A mantra? A sick joke? Or was Nick trying to document something? A twisted kind of justice? And if so, for whom? Think about this. The Reiners were known for being outspoken. They supported progressive causes, hosted fundraisers, donated millions to mental health organizations, addiction recovery programs, and more. They were champions of truth, accountability, and social justice. But what if, just what if, they were hiding something? What if the perfect image was just that, an image? And what if Nick, in his broken brilliance, decided to tear that image down from the inside? Let's go back to the bodies. By the time the medical examiner finished processing the scene, the count was 16. 16 individuals. All dead. All placed with purpose. All connected, in some way, to the Reiner family's past. Some were missing persons, long thought to have been lost to the city's underbelly. Others were barely adults. Runaways. Anonymous. But two, had once been guests at a Reiner-hosted gala just years prior. That's right. 2 of the dead had attended charity events inside that very mansion. Photos surfaced showing them smiling beside Rob and Michelle. So now we have to ask, how did they end up in the garage? Why was there no trace of them after those events? And how could Nick have possibly pulled all of this off alone? It's a horrifying thought, isn't it? That someone so close to Hollywood royalty could have orchestrated something so gruesome right under everyone's noses. But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did the tape. Because yes, there was a tape. Found beneath the floorboards of Nick's guest house, wrapped in plastic, labeled only with one word: forgiveness. And what was on it? That part hasn't been made public yet. But sources who've heard it say it's the most disturbing audio they've ever encountered. They say you can hear breathing, whispers, a voice, low, calm, and calculating, reciting names like a prayer. Some of the names, victims. Others, still alive. For now. So what exactly was going on inside that house? Was it revenge? A twisted art project? A mental breakdown spiraling into methodical destruction? Or was it something far more orchestrated? Could Nick have been part of a network? A secret society? A cult? It sounds ridiculous, until you remember that Hollywood has always had a dark side. We've seen it time and time again. Secret tapes, cover-ups, exploitation, silence. And maybe, just maybe, Nick Reiner was the one person who couldn't take the silence anymore. Maybe he wanted the world to see what had been ignored. Maybe the garage wasn't just a storage space. Maybe it was a confession. But just when investigators thought they had it all mapped out, they found something else. Something small, insignificant at first glance. A torn page from a notebook, tucked inside the pocket of Rob Reiner's bloodied trousers. On it, a sentence scrawled in red ink. Don't blame him. I should have stopped this years ago. Signed, Mr. That's when the entire story turned sideways. Because if Michelle Reiner knew something and chose not to act, what exactly had this family been protecting? What secrets were worth that kind of silence? And more terrifyingly, what else had they buried? Have you ever walked into a room that felt wrong before you even saw anything? Where the air was too still, where the silence wasn't peaceful, it was thick. Where your instincts screamed something had gone horribly wrong, but you couldn't yet say why. That was exactly the feeling that wrapped around Graciella's chest the moment she stepped onto the Reiner estate that Sunday morning. And in just under 20 minutes, the illusion of safety would be obliterated. The morning began like any other. Sunlight pierced through the bougainvillea that climbed along the estate gates. Birds chirped lazily overhead. Brentwood, nestled in its cocoon of wealth and greenery, looked picture-perfect. But something was off. Graciella had been the Reiners' housekeeper for over 2 decades. She'd seen their children grow up. She'd seen Michelle cry in the kitchen after tough arguments. She'd cleaned Rob's coffee spills from stacks of old scripts. She knew the rhythms of the house like a conductor knows a symphony. And that morning, the rhythm was gone. The gate wasn't fully latched. The porch light, usually off by sunrise, still glowed faintly in the daylight. The Reiner's aging Labrador, Cheddar, wasn't padding up to greet her at the steps. That dog never missed a chance for attention. She rang the bell once. Nothing. Twice. Still nothing. Then she saw the newspaper, still sitting at the foot of the door. The Los Angeles Times, dated Sunday, December 14th, the same day everything changed. Graciella's throat tightened. She pulled out her phone and called Michelle's line. Straight to voicemail. She tried Romy. No answer. Then she walked around to the kitchen entrance, just like she'd done 1,000 times. And the moment her hand gripped the door handle, she knew. It was unlocked. That had never happened before. Not in 20 years. What Graciella saw inside was the kind of sight no loyal friend should ever be forced to witness. The kitchen, usually so pristine, looked like it had been ransacked in silence. Chairs overturned. Drawers halfway open. A shattered mug on the floor near the sink. And blood. So much blood. At first, she thought it was spilled wine. Rob was a red wine lover. But it was too dark. Too viscous. It trailed in smudges from the refrigerator to the far hallway. And then she saw the sweater. Rob's tan cardigan. The one he always wore during winter mornings. Crumpled on the floor, soaked in red. Her scream echoed through the mansion. Then she ran. Not upstairs. Not into the hallway. But out. Straight down the corridor, past the living room, through the back door, and into the driveway, where she finally allowed her panic to rise like floodwater. Her 911 call was shaky, barely coherent. I think they're dead, she stammered. Dispatch tried to calm her. Asked for an address. A description. But all she could do was keep repeating. There's blood, and they're not answering. They're not answering. Within 12 minutes, LAPD patrol cars descended on the estate. Within 30, the perimeter was taped off. And within the hour, the Brentwood mansion, home to Hollywood royalty, was no longer a place of comfort. It was a crime scene. Officer Tyrone Gillespie was first to enter. He would later say the silence inside the Reiner home felt unnatural. Not just quiet, but suffocating. He moved slowly, hand on his weapon, calling out names. Mr. Reiner? Mrs. Reiner. No response. Living room, clear. Dining room, untouched. Then he reached the hallway. The trail of blood was clearer now, thicker, leading to the master suite. And what he found there would make even the most hardened detective take pause. Rob Reiner lay on his back beside the bed, eyes wide open, hands slack, multiple stab wounds to the abdomen and chest. A defensive cut across his right palm, suggesting he'd tried, and failed, to protect himself. Michelle was nearby, slumped against the dresser. A single stab wound to the heart. Eyes closed, face pale, but peaceful. As if she had accepted what was happening. There were no signs of a struggle beyond those moments. No forced entry. No broken windows. Just violence. Swift. Focused. Personal. But here's the part that still haunts the officers who walked into that room. Both Rob and Michelle were barefoot. Both in their pajamas. No signs of waking up and running. No sign they'd even made it out of the bedroom. It was as if the killer knew their routine. Knew when they'd be most vulnerable. Knew exactly where to strike. Which raised the most terrifying possibility. This wasn't the work of a stranger. This was someone they trusted. The detectives were already piecing it together when they interviewed Nick. Found in the guest house behind the main estate. Still in his boxers. Disoriented. Disheveled. But not panicked. He told the officers he'd been asleep. Said he hadn't seen his parents since the night before. Claimed he thought they were out for brunch. But the brunch reservations were still on the kitchen counter. Untouched. Same with Rob's phone. Michelle's purse. Her glasses. Nick's tone was casual. Almost too casual. He offered no emotion. No questions. No, what happened? Or are they okay? Just a dull, vacant stare. Still, there was no physical evidence to hold him. Yet. So they logged everything. Searched the house. Photographed every inch. And then, as the forensic team moved outside to catalog the surrounding area, one technician noticed something strange. The garage. Its side door was cracked open. Only about a foot. Maybe less. Like someone had opened it recently and not bothered to shut it fully. Or maybe it couldn't shut all the way. Officer Gillespie decided to check it out. He called for backup. Two others joined him. One held a flashlight, the other a camera. And then Gillespie pushed the door open. The light swept the space, and everything changed. Let me ask you something. How many people do you know with garages full of junk? Old furniture, Christmas boxes, paint cans, tools. That's what Gillespie expected. But that's not what he found. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Rot. Decay. Something wet and old. The kind of smell that clings to your skin. And then, bodies. At first, they thought it was just one. Then two. Then they realized. They were stacked. Hidden beneath tarps. Between furniture. Some wrapped in plastic. Some not. One had a name tag from a hospital on her wrist. Another still wore a bracelet from a charity gala. All dead. All dumped. Right there, next to Rob's garden rake and Michelle's gardening gloves. Detectives were stunned. How had no one noticed? Had the Reiners known? Had they been blackmailed? Threatened? Or were they complicit? And most of all, how long had these people been dead? By the end of the day, the mansion had been swarmed by the FBI, LAPD homicide, and a forensics team that would later say it was one of the most disturbing crime scenes in California history. 16 bodies, all with different times of death. Some recent, others almost mummified. But they were all connected somehow. To the Reiners, to Nick, to the world that once called that home a palace. And that morning, when the Reiners didn't answer the door, it wasn't just because they were dead. It was because a chapter had closed. A curtain had fallen. A mask had been ripped off. And behind it, a truth no one was ready for. But the clues left behind wouldn't just lead to Nick's troubled past. They would crack open a history of secrets the Reiners had fought to keep buried. How does a dream home become a crime scene? How does a place filled with memories, awards, laughter, and legacies suddenly feel like it's hiding something unspeakable? Because the Reiner estate was supposed to be safe, a fortress of success, a monument to love, a home built not just with money, but with meaning. And yet, behind the trimmed hedges, beneath the polished floors, and beyond the locked doors, something had gone rotten. Not overnight, but slowly, quietly. Until one day, it spilled out, leaving 16 bodies behind and a legacy soaked in blood. Let's rewind. The Brentwood estate wasn't just another Hollywood mansion. It was the Reiner residence. Bought in the early 1990s, the $13.5 million property sat like a crown jewel in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods. Gated, guarded, gorgeous. A two-story Mediterranean masterpiece with 6 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, a private screening room, a wine cellar, and a garage large enough to house a small production crew. To the world, it was a symbol of Rob and Michelle's success. To the inner circle, it was a sanctuary. And to Nick, it was a cage. The walls inside the home were lined with framed movie posters. The Princess Bride, Misery, A Few Good Men, Stand By Me. All Rob's work. All celebrated. The living room had a grand piano Michelle once played during holiday dinners. The dining table was the same one where Romy had celebrated her 10th birthday. And then there was the wall. That's what the family called it. A floor-to-ceiling display of achievements, plaques, festival awards, family photos. It was the Reiner Hall of Fame. And it was immaculate. Never a frame out of place. Never a dust speck in sight. Everything was positioned, curated. But one photo had been removed. A gap sat at the top right corner of the display. Nick's high school graduation portrait, gone. Taken down. Never replaced. And no one talked about it. Ever. Sources close to the family say that photo disappeared not long after Nick's second rehab stint. He was 20, fresh out of detox, trying to stay clean. But the family tension? Still thick. Rob and Michelle wanted him to live in a sober house. Nick refused. He wanted to stay on the estate, in the guest house. They agreed, reluctantly. And that's when the silence started. Phone calls became less frequent. Dinners fewer. At some point, Nick started eating alone, living like a shadow behind the mansion's manicured facade. Guests who visited rarely saw him. Some didn't even know he still lived there. He became, in their words, invisible. But something else changed inside the house too. Staff were let go. First the gardener, then the night guard. Security cameras were repositioned, some disabled. The garage began to fill with clutter. Boxes no one touched. Furniture no one remembered buying. Strangers showed up at odd hours. Delivery men, contractors, people who never gave names. When asked, Michelle said it was just renovation work. But nothing was ever renovated. Rooms were locked, areas sealed off, and then there was the humming. One staff member, before she was fired, claimed she heard a low mechanical hum coming from beneath the garage at night. She asked Michelle about it once. The next morning, she received a severance package and was escorted off the property. No explanation, no reference, just gone. But let's talk about the garage. The official blueprint of the house, on file with the city, shows the garage as a standard 2-car space with additional storage. But officers found something that wasn't on the blueprints. A small door behind the tool cabinets, almost invisible, painted to match the wall. Inside, a narrow corridor, low ceiling, cold air, bare bulbs flickering. At the end of the corridor, a locked hatch. And behind that hatch, a basement, not listed on any city record, not registered with any contractor. It was custom, and it was deliberately hidden. The basement was empty, mostly, except for a chair, a single folding chair, and a table. On the table, an audio recorder, and beside it, a photo of Rob Reiner. Eyes scratched out. Across the back of the photo, in black marker. "You forgot what you taught me." What did that mean? What had Rob taught Nick? And why had Nick felt betrayed? Investigators began digging into family history, film history, even into Rob's lesser-known activism. They found letters, emails, donations made anonymously, whispers of things kept out of the press, and one disturbing allegation from a woman who claimed to have worked as an intern at Castle Rock Entertainment years prior. She alleged that Nick had once followed her home after a company dinner, that he left notes on her windshield. When she told Rob, he dismissed it, told her Nick was going through a tough time. She left Los Angeles 3 weeks later, and never returned. Was this a pattern? A cover-up? Or just a desperate father trying to protect his broken son? Either way, the house reflected it, not just in its silence, but in its architecture. So many hidden corners, so many locked doors, a perfectly curated world, except for what was buried underneath. Detectives also found something odd in Rob's office. A drawer filled with rejection letters, all addressed to Nick, from studios, agencies, producers. Most were polite, standard, but a few were blunt, unstable, too dark, refused to take notes. Hostile. One note, scribbled in Rob's handwriting, read, "Try again, but soften the edges. It's too angry." Nick had circled the word angry, and next to it, written in red ink, "I learned from you." So what was the house, really? A castle? A cage? A theater stage for a family pretending everything was fine while chaos festered in the wings? Every time someone opened a door, investigators held their breath. Would there be another body? Another note? Another secret? They found family videos, taped over, old birthday footage, edited with strange cuts and inserted static. One tape labeled Nick's 7th birthday cut halfway through to show a dark hallway. Nothing else, just static and breathing. The FBI began piecing it together. They believed the house was part of Nick's design, a living, breathing narrative, a script he was writing in real time. Only it wasn't fiction. It was real. He lived in that garage. He built his basement. He watched his parents move through life while he plotted in the shadows. And no one noticed. Because the house was beautiful. Because they were the Reiners. Because no one expects monsters to live in mansions. But let me ask you something. What if Nick wasn't the only one hiding something? What if Rob knew? What if Michelle chose to stay quiet? What if the dream wasn't delusion, but a deal? A trade-off? A carefully constructed world where silence bought safety? It's a horrifying thought, but one that gained traction when police found a letter in Michelle's personal journal, dated 6 months before her death. It read, "I'm afraid of what I know, but I'm more afraid of what the world will think if they find out we knew and did nothing." The House of Dreams? Maybe it was always a nightmare, but masked in designer wallpaper and glowing headlines. Now, it's an empty shell. The walls have been stripped. The blood has been cleaned, but the energy still lingers. Every room tells a story. Every silence feels like it's holding its breath. And somewhere in those walls, you can almost hear the faint hum of something unfinished. Because as one detective put it, this house isn't done talking yet. But the son who once lived in the shadows of that house, he's about to take center stage. And what he reveals next will turn this story inside out. What happens when the child of a Hollywood legend doesn't want to follow the script? When he's handed everything, privilege, pedigree, a place in the spotlight, and instead chooses to vanish into the shadows. Nick Reiner wasn't just the son of Rob Reiner. He was the heir to a legacy. A kid born into red carpets, backstage passes, and private screenings. He was the golden child. Until he wasn't. Until he became the ghost who haunted the house no one dared question. And by the time they looked close enough, it was already too late. Let's go back. Before the sirens. Before the tape. Before the garage became a graveyard. Let's talk about Nick Reiner, the boy who was supposed to carry the torch. Born in 1992, Nick was the youngest of Rob and Michelle's children. From day one, the world around him was curated. He grew up surrounded by brilliance, actors, directors, writers. Dinners at Spielberg's house. Weekend brunches with Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks. Childhood playdates with the sons and daughters of the Hollywood elite. But behind the glamour, Nick struggled. Teachers said he was bright, brilliant, even. But he was also volatile, impulsive, isolated, obsessed with horror films and dark literature. While other kids drew superheroes, Nick filled his notebooks with crime scenes. One teacher recalled a fourth-grade assignment where students had to write about their dream vacation. Nick's essay? A detailed description of escaping from a mental institution and living under a false identity in a forest full of skeletons. He was 9. By age 13, the cracks had widened. Nick began skipping school. He was caught shoplifting from a vintage bookstore. He was found unconscious behind the wheel of his mother's car in a parking lot in Beverly Hills. Pills spilled across the passenger seat. It was the first time the Reiner name shielded him. The police report was sealed. The incident never made the papers. But insiders knew. The whispers started. Nick's troubled. He's creative, but intense. He's going through a phase. Except the phase never ended. By 15, he was in and out of rehab. Utah, Arizona, Malibu, each center more exclusive than the last. And each time he returned home, something was different. He was quieter, colder, smarter, but not better. Never better. Michelle kept a journal. One of her earliest entries about Nick's struggle reads, "He looks through me, as if I'm not his mother, but a stranger he's already decided not to trust." She wanted to believe he could heal. She pushed therapy. She prayed. Rob, meanwhile, threw himself into his work, took projects back to back. Some friends claim he did it to escape. Others say he was just doing what he knew best, directing. Trying to script a happy ending for a son who kept rewriting the plot. Then came Being Charlie. The film was supposed to be their redemption arc. Co-written by Nick. Directed by Rob. The story of a young man battling addiction, love, and the crushing expectations of being the son of someone famous. It was raw, honest, painful. Nick said it was the most personal thing I've ever created. He was 23, and for a moment, the world applauded. Critics praised the bravery. Hollywood leaned in. Finally, the Reiner boy had found his voice. But behind the scenes, things were fracturing again. Nick didn't want edits. He fought producers. He accused his father of watering down the truth. One anonymous source from the production said he was brilliant, but scary, like he was using the film to settle scores, and we didn't know who was next. When the movie released, it underperformed. Quiet box office. Lukewarm reviews. Nick spiraled. And then, he disappeared. For the next 5 years, Nick Reiner became a myth. Some said he was writing a novel. Others claimed he'd moved to Europe. A few believed he was dead. But in reality, he was right there, living in the guest house behind his parents' estate. Rarely seen, never spoken of. Even during parties and fundraisers, guests weren't allowed near the guest house. One caterer later told police, "We were warned, do not enter the guest quarters. If he comes out, let him pass. Do not speak." So what was he doing in there? Writing? Plotting? Watching? Investigators now believe Nick spent those years building something. Not a career, not a script, but a world, a system. He cataloged things, people, moments. He kept journals, hundreds of them, filed, labeled, annotated, some with real names, others with codes. Inside one, investigators found a chilling line written over and over. "Their silence was louder than my screams." In another, a hand-drawn map of the estate. But not the one on file. This one had hidden corridors, secret panels, tunnels that didn't exist yet. They were blueprints, plans, designs, drawings of the future. A future Nick seemed to think was inevitable. And then there were the lists. Pages and pages of names. Some of them, interns, PAs, former classmates. All of them, people who had once interacted with the Reiner family in some capacity. Beside each name, a word. Sometimes, complicit, or liar, or coward, and once in red ink. Father. This wasn't just emotional venting. This was something else. A manifesto. A meticulous documentation of perceived betrayal. Pain turned into obsession. Memory turned into evidence. And the target wasn't just the world. It was his parents. Police believe Nick saw himself as the truth teller. The one person who wasn't willing to play along. He didn't want fame. He wanted justice. His version of it. Twisted, delusional, lethal, but to him, honest. When they arrested him, he said nothing, just stared ahead. Even as officers listed the charges. Even as reporters screamed questions. Even as his sister, Romy, broke down outside the courtroom. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't even blink. As if the moment had already played out in his head 1,000 times. And maybe it had. The scariest villains aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet, observant, patient. Nick Reiner was all of those. He didn't lash out in anger. He waited. He watched. He built his world, brick by brick, secret by secret, until it was ready. Until he was ready. And when he finally stepped into the spotlight, it wasn't for applause. It was for confrontation. He didn't want fame. He wanted reckoning. And he got it. But what if Nick wasn't acting alone? What if someone else had been feeding the fire? What if he wasn't the only ghost in the house? Because when detectives opened his final journal, they found a signature at the bottom of the last page. And it wasn't Nick's. It was someone far more unexpected. And when they traced that name, it led to a discovery that would make the garage look tame by comparison. It was never supposed to be opened. That's what one officer whispered after the crime scene was processed. The garage, spacious, dimly lit, and silent, had always been thought of as just another part of the mansion. A place for Rob Reiner's old movie props. Boxes of memorabilia, gardening tools, old furniture. But what investigators found wasn't a storage room. It was a crypt, a carefully arranged, deliberately orchestrated shrine of death. And once that door opened, so did the truth. Oozing out like blood from a wound that had been festering for years. Officer Delia Torres was the first to set foot inside. Even with over a decade of homicide experience, she hesitated. The smell hit before the light did. It was something thicker than rot. Not just decomposing flesh. Not just old paint and mildew. It was the scent of things deliberately forgotten. Of secrets that had been locked away and left to ferment. She called for backup. 2 other officers joined her. One with a flashlight, the other with a camera. What they found, step by step, would leave even the most hardened members of the force shaken. The first shape appeared behind the left side of the garage, covered in a dusty painter's tarp. The flashlight caught the edge of a sneaker beneath it. Torres pulled the sheet back slowly. A body. Female. Mid-20s. Blonde. Bruised face. Eyes open. Mouth taped shut. Hands tied. Dead. But not recently. Estimated time of death? At least 4 months prior. Before anyone could process that, they found another. Then another. And another. By the end of the first sweep, the count was 16. 16 bodies. Stacked like forgotten trash. But placed with disturbing precision. One was in a vintage wheelchair. Another, propped upright in a folding chair with duct tape holding the body in place, facing the garage entrance, as if greeting visitors. A third had a yellowing envelope taped to her chest. Inside, a note. For words. See me now, Dad? The entire crime scene came to a standstill. Forensic teams halted. Officers vomited. The LAPD chief was called to the scene personally. The garage had become more than a murder scene. It was a message board. An art installation of agony. Every corpse seemed to represent something. A theme. A symbol. A line from a narrative only Nick understood. But there was more. Much more. Tucked behind an old shelving unit, officers found a cabinet, locked. It was pried open at 3:11 p.m. Inside were journals. Notebooks stacked like files. Each labeled. Project 1, Blonde. Project 4, The Producer. Project 9, The Mute. Project 16, Mother. Each book contained drawings, photos of the victims, journal entries, postmortem notes. Nick had documented everything. From abduction methods to emotional states. From what the victims had said in their final moments to what he thought they represented in his life. It was methodical, obsessive, sociopathic, and deeply cinematic. You see, Nick wasn't just killing. He was directing. This garage wasn't a graveyard. It was a soundstage. Each body was a character. Each kill, a scene. Each corner of the room arranged like a shot in a film. In fact, on the wall across from the corpses was a mounted flat-screen television, connected to a dusty, humming hard drive. When investigators accessed it, they found 16 video files, each titled, Take 1, Take 2, Take 3, up to Take 16. Each file was a recording. Each showed one of the victims in the final days or hours before their death. Most were shot in a dimly lit room with a spotlight on the victim. The camera never wavered. Nick's voice can be heard behind it. Calm, almost soothing. He asked them questions. He asked about their past, about lies they had told, about moments they regretted, about secrets they'd never confessed. And when they answered, he clapped his hands once and said, "Cut." Then the screen would go black. The footage alone would have been damning. But what really chilled investigators was this. Some of the victims were known, not famous, but familiar. 2 were former assistants on Rob's film sets. One was a caterer who had worked a Reiner charity event. Another had been a background actor in Being Charlie. Suddenly, the connections were forming. These weren't random killings. These were carefully selected symbols in Nick's twisted cinematic universe. And his masterpiece was unfolding inside the garage. Then came the freezer, hidden beneath a false floor panel. It was discovered after a forensic dog began barking at the southwest corner of the garage. They pulled back the flooring, lifted the panel, and there it was, a chest freezer, locked with a rusted latch. Inside, one body, wrapped in velvet. Male, older. Autopsy would later reveal, killed within the last 48 hours. Unlike the others, this one had no documentation, no journal entry, no video file, no name. Just a sticky note attached to his forehead. Deleted scene. To this day, no one knows who he was. No matches in the system. No dental records. No fingerprints. Just another piece of Nick's production. A bonus feature, maybe. Or worse, a preview of more to come. But the horror didn't end with bodies. Investigators also found scripts, printed in screenplay format, written by Nick. Over 1,000 pages total. They weren't just screenplays. They were confessions. Each script was a dramatized version of a real murder, formatted like a Hollywood blockbuster, with stage directions, dialogue, scene transitions, character arcs. In one, titled The Replacement, a character based on Rob Reiner is slowly poisoned by his own son, who believes the father sold out the truth to preserve his image. In another, The Final Draft, a mother chooses to remain silent about the crimes of her child, only to be punished for her cowardice. Sound familiar? They were fictionalized, yes, but not subtle. They were mirrors, twisted reflections of the family Nick had grown up in. And by the time he wrote the final line of the final script, he had already begun casting. With real people, real lives, real blood. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was what was nailed into the ceiling beams above the corpses. 16 wooden placards, each hand-carved, each with a phrase. Gossip, gluttony, pride, cowardice, blindness, loyalty, control. Each body aligned beneath a word. Nick wasn't just killing. He was judging. He had assigned sins to each victim, sins only he believed they'd committed. He became the jury, the executioner, the director of their final act. And the garage? It was the theater. No one saw it coming. How could they? He was a recluse. He was quiet. He was the troubled artist in the back house. No one thought to ask what he was doing in the garage for hours. No one questioned the stacks of boxes. No one opened the locked cabinet. Because when you're the son of a legend, people look the other way. And Nick? He counted on it. But here's the part that will stay with you. As officers were cataloging the final evidence, they noticed a line etched into the garage wall behind the freezer, barely visible, scratched into the wood. It read, Scene 17 starts soon. There were only 16 bodies. So who was next? Was Nick planning another murder? Was there an accomplice? Was the real climax still to come? Because if Nick saw this all as a story, then maybe we were only at the midpoint, and the third act might still be coming. What if the bodies in Nick Reiner's garage weren't just victims, but messages? What if they weren't random? What if each one told a story, whispered a secret, connected to something far deeper than anyone imagined? 16 corpses, 16 missing persons, some forgotten, some erased, some quietly mourned without answers, until now. And each one, when identified, would expose a new crack in the Reiner legacy. Because this wasn't just a mass murder. It was a mosaic, and Nick had pieced it together over years, one victim at a time. The process of identifying the bodies took weeks. DNA, dental records, fingerprints, facial recognition. It was slow, methodical, gut-wrenching work. Each time a name was matched, it triggered a cascade of notifications. Families, databases, case files once thought cold. And as the names came in, the connections started to form. Victim number 1, Jane Lucy. Age, 27. Disappeared, 2019. Last seen, West Hollywood, working catering at a private charity event hosted by Rob and Michelle Reiner. According to her mother, Jane came home that night shaken. She said something strange happened at the party, that someone had cornered her near the back garden. When asked who, she simply said, "He was someone powerful. Someone whose name I'm not supposed to say." She never showed up to work the next day. Her missing persons case gathered dust until now. When Jane's name came up in Nick's journals, it was under one label. The one who knew. Victim number 4, Elias Morgan. Age, 34. Disappeared, 2017. Background, part-time script reader for Castle Rock Entertainment. Elias had submitted a disturbing memo to a studio exec weeks before his disappearance. In it, he outlined concerning narrative themes in a script submitted anonymously to the studio. That script? Now believed to be written by Nick Reiner. The memo described the script as obsessed with psychological torture, voyeurism, and retribution, clearly not fictional. He recommended it be rejected and flagged. 2 weeks later, he was gone. His family believed he'd moved overseas, but his bank accounts remained untouched. His phone was never reactivated. He became another name on a long list of LA's forgotten. Until now. Victim number 7, Jessica Romero. Age, 19. Disappeared, 2020. Background. A runaway from San Diego, last seen hitchhiking near Sunset Boulevard. This one hit detectives hard. She had no known connection to the Reiners. No employment ties. No social media overlap. But in Nick's journal, she appeared under innocence. He had written about her over and over. She doesn't know what they've done. She smiles despite the weight of it. She makes the silence scream. Psychiatrists reviewing Nick's files believe Jessica may have triggered a moral contradiction in him. A purity he couldn't destroy or couldn't allow to survive in a world he thought was too rotten for her. Her body was found in the back corner of the garage, wrapped gently, no visible bruises, tucked beside a blanket and a small toy horse carved from wood. It was clear she was different, which raises the question, was she killed or simply silenced? As the list grew, patterns became undeniable. Of the 16 victims, 5 had worked on or around Rob Reiner film sets. 3 were young women who attended Reiner family events. 2 were interns or assistants in entertainment law firms linked to Rob's production companies. 4 were missing persons with no apparent ties to Hollywood, but appeared in Nick's journals under metaphoric names like the Catalyst, the Doubter, and the Denier. 2 remained unidentified for now. It wasn't a list of enemies. It was a cast list, and each one seemed to represent a theme, a wound, a scene in Nick's sprawling psychological production. The most horrifying moment came with the discovery of victim number 12. Her name was Samantha Trowbridge. She had been missing for over a decade. Reported missing in 2012, last seen outside a Brentwood coffee shop. At the time, her disappearance sparked brief media attention, but no suspect was ever named. She was labeled a runaway. Case closed. But here's where it gets disturbing. Samantha had a history of modeling. In 2011, she posed for a promotional campaign for a short film that was executive produced by Rob Reiner. The film never aired publicly. It was pulled from distribution quietly and never spoken of again. Some claimed it was too experimental. Others claimed it never existed at all. But Samantha's body was found in the garage, with a printed photo of that film set pinned to her chest. And on the back of the photo, a note. She played her role perfectly, but no one applauded. Detectives were now convinced this wasn't a spree. It was a long-term plan, years in the making, a masterwork of vengeance, obsession, and symbolic slaughter. But it wasn't just about Nick, because something in the files, something in the patterns, hinted at another player. Another person who knew what was going on. Maybe even someone who helped. Enter victim number 15. A male. ID. Unconfirmed for weeks. But then a breakthrough. Fingerprint match to a former employee of Castle Rock Entertainment. Name, Calvin R. Beck. Role, archive manager. He had access to internal studio documents. Old footage. Unreleased content. Beck had been fired in 2014 for allegedly leaking private production photos to tabloids. But before his dismissal, he sent an email to his attorney titled, Insurance Policy. In it, he wrote, "If anything happens to me, it's because I've seen too much. I know what Nick did. I know what Rob covered. I know what they kept quiet. And if the garage is ever opened, God help whoever finds it." That email was never followed up. Calvin disappeared days later. His apartment was emptied, and no one looked for him, until his corpse turned up beneath a sheet of movie scripts in Nick's crypt. He had been stabbed 13 times. Nick's journal entry for him was simple. Truth can't leak if it's dead. So let's ask the hard question. Was Rob Reiner covering up crimes? Did he know about the people disappearing around his family? Did Michelle? And if they didn't, how did they not? Because it's hard to imagine that 16 people, some of whom had been inside that house, could vanish without someone noticing. Or worse, without someone choosing not to notice. The press erupted as the names of the victims were released. Articles flooded in. BuzzFeed, CNN, Reddit forums exploded. Podcasters dissected each name. TikTok detectives made timelines. Families of the victims began speaking out. One woman, a sister of victim number 2, stood outside the courthouse with a trembling voice. "We begged the police to keep looking. We knew she didn't just leave. But when you don't have money, when you're not famous, they stop caring. And he knew that. He used that. She wasn't wrong." Some of the victims were marginalized. Runaways. Workers. Interns. Nobodies in the machine. But Nick saw them, and he turned their invisibility into symbols. Then he turned those symbols into corpses. By the time the 16th name was confirmed, LAPD quietly released a statement. "We believe this list of victims represents a pattern of targeted killings. We believe the suspect considered each victim a representation of something larger, an ideal, a betrayal, a flaw in the system." This was not impulse. This was ideology. But ideology born from what? Abuse? Neglect? Delusion? Or revelation? Because as investigators began connecting more dots, they realized something unnerving. Most of the victims had filed complaints. Workplace grievances. Harassment accusations. HR flags. All surrounding the entertainment world. Some had named names. Big names. Not just Rob, but others. Directors. Writers. Executives. Men still working. Still rich. Still powerful. And now, they were circling the wagons. Calling lawyers. Going silent. Because Nick may have been the killer. But he might have also been the last witness to a deeper rot. Then came the twist. Just when detectives thought they had all the names, all the connections, all the bodies accounted for, another journal surfaced. This one buried in the ceiling insulation of Nick's guest house. Inside, a 17th name. A woman not on the official body list. Her photo was taped to the inside cover. And next to it, "She's not here, but she should be." Her name? Rob Reiner. Nick's sister. Still alive. Still silent. Still hiding something. And when she finally speaks, she'll either bury the past or blow it wide open. What if the first clues to a massacre weren't hidden in a garage, but whispered in a therapy circle years earlier? What if the first bodies were born not in blood, but in confessions? In drawings? In disturbed dreams shared under fluorescent lights and the scent of institutional bleach? Because before the garage, before the scripts, before the 16 names were carved into death, Nick Reiner was talking, and someone should have listened. Nick's battle with addiction wasn't a footnote. It was a defining chapter. By 15, he was already a veteran of the rehab circuit. First stop, an elite outpatient facility in Malibu. Second, a desert wilderness program in Utah. Third, Harmony Lakes, one of California's most expensive residential rehab centers, nicknamed Hollywood's Asylum for its celebrity clientele. It was there, at Harmony Lakes, that the whispers began. Most rehab stories follow a familiar arc: arrival, denial, breakthrough, tears, healing. But Nick didn't follow the arc. He rewrote it. Staff records, recently unsealed, reveal that Nick exhibited what they called alarming narrative behavior. He didn't just talk about trauma. He scripted it. He'd draw diagrams of how his life should have unfolded. He'd sketch scenes in his notebook, complete with stage directions. In one journal entry from that time, he wrote, "Every rehab is an audition, but no one's watching. So you either overact or you improvise the monster." A former roommate from Harmony Lakes, who requested anonymity, shared a chilling memory. He wasn't like the others. We were all messed up, yeah, but he wanted to be there. Not to heal, but to observe. He used to sit in group therapy and write down people's fears like he was studying for a role. One night, the roommate woke to find Nick crouched near his bed. He was whispering to himself, over and over, "You can't save them. You can only archive them." Counselors dismissed the behavior as dissociation tied to substance withdrawal. But it didn't stop. Nick created a list titled, "People Who Deserve a Script." 16 names. None real. Or so they thought. But cross-referencing those names today reveals horrifying parallels. One name, Lana K., shared a last name with victim number 8. Another, Dr. Calvin, nearly identical to Castle Rock employee Calvin Beck. A third, Jessica the Horse Girl. A likely reference to Jessica Romero, the 19-year-old runaway found in the garage. He wasn't writing fiction. He was writing a future obituary list. And then there were the therapy tapes. Harmony Lakes, like many facilities, recorded group sessions for clinical review. Detectives obtained access to these archives. The tapes are chilling. Nick, calm, detached, articulate, like a director giving notes. In one session, he said, "Everyone here thinks they're the main character. But the truth is, most people are just background noise. My job is to cut the static." Another, "My dad taught me how to build characters. He didn't realize I was building his." One therapist, Monica Greaves, became particularly disturbed. She filed 3 incident reports on Nick. One, after he turned in a short film script in which the main character murders his family with a tire iron and stores the bodies in a garage. Another, after he constructed a cardboard diorama of a home with tiny clay figures, each with names of fellow patients. And a third, after he left a note on her desk reading, "Some people talk. Some people record. I cast." Monica's complaints were logged, noted, ignored. Why? Because the Reiner name came with gravity, and funding, and reputation, and lawsuits they couldn't afford. Monica eventually resigned. But before she left, she took copies of Nick's early writings. She kept them hidden, until the garage discovery made headlines. And then she called the police. What she turned over would become a bombshell in the case. A folder of Nick's creative assignments. Inside, a 12-page handwritten treatment titled The Archive, a story about a man who believes the world has forgotten what matters, so he captures people's confessions before killing them and storing them in a refrigerated bunker. A drawing of a house, labeled Home of Mirrors, with red XS over specific rooms. A journal entry that simply read, "People don't remember what you said, but they remember where you placed the bodies." Detectives now believe Nick began planning his project as early as age 17. He wasn't improvising. He wasn't reacting. He was building. He had a blueprint. And Harmony Lakes wasn't the only place that failed to act. After being discharged, Nick was admitted to Silver Ridge, a spiritual therapy facility in Northern California. Records show he was involved in at least 2 violent outbursts. In one, he attacked a fellow patient during a role-play exercise after the patient refused to play the father. Nick screamed, "That's not how he talks. Say the line right." In another session, a counselor asked Nick what he wanted out of life. He replied, "To be remembered for truth, and to make sure the lies are buried under something heavier than dirt." So why didn't anyone stop him? Why didn't his parents pull him out? Why didn't doctors raise red flags loud enough to echo through the walls of privilege? The answer? Power, wealth, fear, and perhaps guilt. Because multiple staff members later testified, off the record, that Rob and